Section 6 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 2, Jewish Heroes and Prophets, by John Lord. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Moses, Part 2. In the ritualism which Moses established, there was the absence of everything which would recall the superstitions and rites, or even the doctrines, of the Egyptians. In view of this, we account partially for the almost studied reticence in respect to a future state, upon which hinged many of the peculiarities of Egyptian worship. It would have been difficult for Moses to have recognized the future state, in the degrading ignorance and sensualism of the Jews, without associating with it the tutelary deities of the Egyptians and all the absurdities connected with the doctrine of metempsychosis, which consigned the victims of future punishment to enter the forms of disgusting and hideous animals, thereby blending with the sublime doctrine of a future state the most degrading superstitions. Bishop Warburton seizes on the silence of Moses respecting a future state to prove, by a learned yet sophistical argument, his divine legation, because he ignored what so essentially entered into the religion of Egypt. But whether Moses purposely ignored this great truth for fear it would be perverted, or because it was a part of the Egyptian economy which he wished his people to forget, still it is also possible that this doctrine of immortality was so deeply engraved on the minds of the people that there was no need to recognize it while giving a system of ritualistic observances. The comparative silence of the Old Testament concerning immortality is one of its most impressive mysteries. However dimly shadowed by Job and David and Isaiah, it seems to have been brought to light only by the Gospel. There is more in the writings of Plato and Cicero about immortality than in the whole of the Old Testament. And this fact is so remarkable that some trace to the sages of Greece and Egypt the doctrine itself, as ordinarily understood, that is, a necessary existence of the soul after death, and they fortify themselves with those declarations of the apostles which represent a happy immortality as the special gift of God, not a necessary existence, but given only to those who obey his laws. If immortality be not a gift, but a necessary existence, as Socrates supposed, it seems strange that heathen philosophers should have speculated more profoundly than the patriarchs of the East on this mysterious subject. We cannot suppose that Plato was more profoundly instructed on such a subject than Abraham and Moses. It is to be noted, however, that God seems to have chosen different races for various missions in the education of his children. As St. Paul puts it, there are diversities of gifts, but the same Spirit; diversities of workings, but the same God who worketh in all. The Hebrew genius was that of discerning and declaring moral and spiritual truth, while that of the Greeks was essentially philosophic and speculative, searching into the reasons and causes of existing phenomena. And it is possible, after all, that the loftiest of the Greek philosophers derived their opinions from those who had been admitted to the secret schools of Egypt, where it is probable that the traditions of primitive ages were preserved, and only communicated to a chosen few, for the ancient schools were esoteric and not popular. The great masters of knowledge believed one thing and the people another. The popular religion was always held in contempt by the wise in all the countries, although upheld by them in external rites and emblems and sacrifices, from patriotic purposes. The last act of Socrates was to sacrifice a cock to Asclepius, with a different meaning from that which was understood by the people. The social and civil code of Moses seems to have had primary reference to the necessary isolation of the Jews, to keep them from the abominations of other nations, and especially idolatry, and even to make them repulsive and disagreeable to foreigners, in order to keep them a peculiar people. The Jew wore an uncouth dress. When he visited strangers, he abstained from their customs and even meats. When a stranger visited the Jew, he was compelled to submit to Jewish restraints. So that the Jew ever seems uncourteous, narrow, obstinate, and grotesque, even as others appeared to him to be pagan and unclean. Moses lays down laws best calculated to keep the nation separated and esoteric; but there is marvellous wisdom in those which were directed to the development of national resources and general prosperity in an isolated state. The nation was made strong for defense, not for aggression. It must depend upon its militia, and not on horses and chariots, which are designed for distant expeditions, for the pomp of kings, for offensive war, and military aggrandizement. The legislation of Moses recognized the peaceful virtues rather than the warlike, agricultural industry, the network of trades and professions, manufacturing skill, production, not waste and destruction. He discouraged commerce, not because it was in itself demoralizing, because it brought the Jews too much in contact with corrupt nations. And he closely defined political power and divided it among different magistrates, instituting a wise balance which would do credit to modern legislation. He gave dignity to the people by making them the ultimate source of authority, next to the authority of God. He separated civil power from the religious, as Calvin did at Geneva. The functions of the priest and the functions of the magistrate were made forever distinct, a radical change from the polity of Egypt, where kings were priests, and priests were civil rulers as well as a literary class, a predominating power to whom all vital interests were entrusted. The kingly power among the Jews was checked and hedged by other powers, so that an overgrown tyranny was difficult and unusual. But above all kingly and priestly power was the power of the invisible King, to whom the judges and monarchs and supreme magistrates were responsible, as simply his delegates and vice-regents. Upon him alone the Jews were to rely in all crises of danger. In him alone was help. And it is remarkable that whenever Jewish rulers relied on chariots and horses and foreign allies, they were delivered into the hands of their enemies. It was only when they fell back upon the protecting arms of their eternal Lord that they were rescued and saved. The mightiest monarch ruled only with delegated powers from him, and it was the memorable loyalty of David to his king which kept him on the throne, as it was self-reliance, the exhibition of independent power, which caused the scepter to depart from Saul. I cannot dwell on the humanity and wisdom which marked the social economy of the Jews, as given by Moses, in the treatment of slaves, emancipated every 50 years, in the sanctity of human life, in the liberation of debtors every 7 years, in kindness to the poor, who were allowed to glean the fields, in the education of the people, in the division of inherited property, in the inalienation of paternal inheritances, in the discouragement of all luxury and extravagance, in those regulations which made disproportionate fortunes difficult, the vast accumulation of which was one of the main causes of the decline of the Roman Empire, and is now one of the most threatening evils of modern civilization. All the civil and social laws of the Jewish commonwealth tended to the elevation of woman and the cultivation of domestic life. What virtues were gradually developed among those sensual slaves whom Moses led through the desert? In what ancient nation were seen such respect to parents, such fidelity to husbands, such charming delights of home, such beautiful simplicities, such ardent loves, such glorious friendships, such regard to the happiness of others? Such, in brief, was the great work which Moses performed, the marvellous legislation which he gave to the Israelites, involving principles accepted by the Christian world in every age of its history. Now, whence had this man this wisdom? Was it the result of his studies and reflections and experiences, or was it a wisdom supernaturally taught him by the Almighty? On the solution of this inquiry into the divine legation of Moses hang momentous issues. It is too grand and important an inquiry to be disregarded by anyone who studies the writings of Moses. It is too suggestive a subject to be passed over even in a literary discourse, for this age is grappling with it in most earnest struggles. No matter whether or not Moses was gifted in a most extraordinary degree to write his code. Nobody doubts his transcendent genius; nobody doubts his wonderful preparation. If any uninspired man could have written it, doubtless it was he. It was the most learned and accomplished of the apostles who was selected to be the expounder of the gospel among the Gentiles; so it was the ablest man born among the Jews who was chosen to give them a national polity. Nor does it detract from his fame as a man of genius that he did not originate the most profound of his declarations. It was fame enough to be the oracle and prophet of Jehovah. I would not dishonor the source of all wisdom, even to magnify the abilities of a great man, fond as critics are of exalting the wisdom of Moses as a triumph of human genius. It is natural to worship strength, human or divine. We adore mind, we glorify oracles. But neither written history nor philosophy will support the work of Moses as a wonder of mere human intellect, without ignoring the declarations of Moses himself and the settled belief of all Christian ages. It is not my object to make an argument in defense of the divine legation of Moses, nor is it my design to reply to the learned criticisms of those who doubt or deny his statements. I would not run a tilt against modern science, which may hereafter explain and accept what it now rejects. Science, whether physical or metaphysical, has its great truths, and so has revelation. The realm of each is distinct, while yet their processes are incomplete. And it is the hope and firm belief of many God-fearing scientists that the patient, reverent searching of today into God's works, of matter and of mind, as it collects the myriad facts and classifies them into such orderly sequences as indicate the laws of their being, will confirm to men's reason their faith in the revealed Word. Clearly, this is a consummation devoutly to be wished. I am not a scientist enough to judge of its probability, but it is within my province to present a few deductions which can be fairly drawn from the denial of the inspiration of the Mosaic Code. I wish to show to what conclusions this denial logically leads. We must remember that Moses himself most distinctly and most emphatically affirms his own divine legation, for is not almost every chapter prefaced with these remarkable words, "And the Lord spake unto Moses"? Jehovah himself, in some incomprehensible way, amid the lightnings and the wonders of the sacred mount, communicated his wisdom. Now, if we disbelieve this direct and impressive affirmation made by Moses, that Jehovah directed him what to say to the people he was called to govern, why should we believe his other statements, which involve supernatural agency or influence pertaining to the early history of the race? Where, then, is his authority? What is his worth? He has indeed no authority at all, except so far as his statements harmonize with our own definite knowledge, and perhaps with scientific speculations. We then make our own reason and knowledge, not the declarations of Moses, the ultimate authority. As a divine oracle to us, his voice is silent; aye, his august voice is drowned by the discordant and contradictory opinions that are ever blended with the speculations of the schools. He tells us, in language of the most impressive simplicity and grandeur, that he was directly instructed and commissioned by Jehovah to communicate moral truths. Truths, we should remember, which no one before him is known to have uttered, and truths so important that the prosperity of nations is identified with them, and will be so identified as long as men shall speculate and dream. If we deny this testimony, then his narration of other facts which we accept is not to be fully credited. Like other ancient histories, it may be and it may not be true, but there is no certainty. However, we may interpret his detailed narration of the genesis of our world and our race, whether as a chronicle or as a symbolic poem, its central theme and thought, the direct creative agency of Jehovah, which it was his privilege to announce, stands forth clear and unmistakable. Yet if we deny the supernaturalism of the Code, we may also deny the supernaturalism of the creation, in so far as both rest on the authority of Moses. And further, if Moses was not inspired directly from God to write his Code, then it follows that he, a man preeminent for wisdom, piety, and knowledge, was an impostor, or at least, like Mohammed and George Fox, a self-deceived and visionary man, since he himself affirms his divine legation, and traces to the direct agency of Jehovah not merely his Code, but even the various deliverances of the Israelites. And not only was Moses mistaken, but the Jewish nation, and Christ, and the apostles, and the greatest lights of the Church from Augustine to Bossuet. Hence it follows necessarily that all the miracles by which the divine legation of Moses is supported and credited have no firm foundation, and a belief in them is superstitious; as indeed it is in all other miracles recorded in the Scriptures, since they rest on testimony no more firmly believed than that believed by Christ and the apostles respecting Moses. Sweep away his authority as an inspiration, and you undermine the whole authority of the Bible. You bring it down to the level of all other books. You make it valuable only as a thesaurus of interesting stories and impressive moral truths, which we accept as we do all other kinds of knowledge, leaving us free to reject what we cannot understand or appreciate, or even what we dislike. Then what follows? Is it not the rejection of many of the most precious revelations of the Bible, to which we wish to cling, and without a belief in which there would be the old despair of paganism, the dreary unsettlement of all religious opinions, even a disbelief in an intelligent First Cause of the universe, certainly of a personal God, and thus a gradual drifting away to the dismal shores of that godless Epicureanism which Socrates derided and Paul and Augustine combated? Do you ask for a confirmation of the truths thus deduced from the denial of the supernaturalism of the Mosaic code? I ask you to look around. I call no names. I invoke no theological hatreds. I seek to inflame no prejudices. I appeal to facts as incontrovertible as the phenomena of the heavens. I stand on the platform of truth itself, which we all seek to know and are proud to confess. Look to the developments of modern thought, to some of the speculations of modern science, to the spirit which animates much of our popular literature, not in our country, but in all countries, even in the schools of the prophets and among men who are more advanced, as they think, in learning, and if you do not see a tendency to the revival of an attractive but exploded philosophy, the philosophy of Democritus, the philosophy of Epicurus, then I am in error as to the signs of the times. But if I am correct in this position, if skepticism or rationalism or pantheism or even science, in the audacity of its denials, or all these combined, are in conflict with the supernaturalism which shines and glows in every book of the Bible, and are bringing back for our acceptance what our fathers scorned, then we must be allowed to show the practical results, the results on life, which of necessity followed the triumph of the speculative opinions of the popular idols of the ancient world in the realm of thought. Oh, what a life was that! What a poor exchange for the certitudes of faith and the simplicities of patriarchal times! I do not know whether an Epicurean philosophy grows out of an Epicurean life, or the life from the philosophy, but both are indissolubly and logically connected. The triumph of one is the triumph of nations, or some terrible and unexpected catastrophe, and the obscuration of all that is glorious and proud among the works of men. I make these, as I conceive, necessary digressions, because a discourse on Moses would be pointless without them; at best only a survey of that marvellous and favored legislator from the standpoint of secular history. I would not pull him down from the lofty pedestal whence he has given laws to all successive generations, a man indeed, but shrouded in those awful mysteries which the great soul of Michael Angelo loved to ponder, and which gave to his creations the power of supernal majesty. Thus did Moses, instructed by God, for this is the great fact revealed in his testimony, lead the inconstant Israelites through a 40 years' pilgrimage, securing their veneration to the last. Thus did he keep them from the idolatries for which they hankered, and preserved among them allegiance to an invisible King. Thus did he impress his own mind and character upon them, and shape their institutions with matchless wisdom. Thus did he give them a system of laws, moral, ceremonial, and civil, which kept them a powerful and peculiar people for more than 1,000 years, and secured a prosperity which culminated in the glorious reigns of David and Solomon, and a political power unsurpassed in Western Asia, to see which the Queen of Sheba came from the uttermost part of the earth; nay, more, which first formulated for that little corner of the world principles and precepts concerning the relations of men to God and to one another, which have been an inspiration to all mankind for thousands of years. Thus did this good and great man fulfill his task and deliver his message, with no other drawbacks on his part than occasional bursts of anger at the unparalleled folly and wickedness of his people. What disinterestedness marks his whole career, from the time when he flies to Pharaoh to the appointment of his successor, relinquishing without regret the virtual government of Egypt, accepting cheerfully the austerities and privations of the land of Midian, never elevating his own family to power, never complaining in his Herculean tasks. With what eloquence does he plead for his people when the anger of the Lord is kindled against them, ever regarding them as mere children who know no self-control. How patient he is in the performance of his duties, accepting counsel from Jethro and listening to the voice of Aaron. With what stern and awful majesty does he lay down the law. What inspiration gilds his features as he descends the mount with the tables in his hands. How terrible he is amid the thunders and lightnings of Sinai, at the rock of Horeb, at the dances around the golden calf, at the rebellion of Korah and Dathan, at the waters of Meribah, at the burning of Nadab and Abihu. How efficient he is in the administration of justice, in the assemblies of the people, in the great councils of rulers and princes, and in all the crises of the state! And yet how gentle, forgiving, tender, and accessible! How sad he is when the people weary of manna and seek flesh to eat! How nobly does he plead with the king of Edom for a passage through his territories! How humbly does he call on God for help amid perplexing cares! Never was a man armed with such authority so patient and so self-distrustful. Never was so experienced and learned a man so little conscious of his greatness. This was the truest warrior that ever buckled sword, this the most gifted poet that ever breathed a word, and never earth's philosopher traced with his golden pen on the deathless page truths half so sage as he wrote down for men. At length, at 125 years of age, with undimmed eye and unabated strength, after having done more for his nation and for posterity than any ruler or king in the world's history, and one of fame which shall last through all the generations of men, growing brighter and brighter as his vast labors and genius are appreciated, the time comes to lay down his burdens. So he assembles together the princes and elders of Israel, recapitulates his laws, enumerates the mercies of the God to whom he has ever been loyal, and gives his final instructions. He appoints Joshua as his successor, adds words of encouragement to the people, whom he so fervently loves, sings his final song, and ascends the mountain above the plains of Moab, from which he is permitted to see, but not to enter, the promised land. Not pensive and sad like Godfrey because he cannot enter Jerusalem, but full of joyous visions of the future glories of his nation, and breaking out in the language of exultation: "Who is like unto thee, O people saved by Jehovah, the shield of thy help and the sword of thy excellency?" So Moses, the like of whom no prophet has since risen, except that later one whom he himself foretold, the greatest man in Jewish annals, passes away from mortal sight, and Jehovah buries him in a valley of the land of Moab, and no man knoweth his sepulchre until this day. That was the grandest funeral that ever passed on earth, but no one heard the trampling or saw the train go forth. Perchance the bald old eagle on gray Beth Peor's height, out of his lonely eyrie, looked on the wondrous sight. And had he not high honor, the hillside for a pall, to lie in state while angels wait, with stars for tapers tall? And the dark rock pines, like tossing plumes, over his bier to wave, and God's own hand in that lonely land to lay him in the grave? O lonely grave in Moab's land, O dark Beth Peor's hill, speak to these curious hearts of ours, and teach them to be still. God hath his mysteries of grace, ways that we cannot tell. He hides them deep, like the hidden sleep of him he loved so well. End of section 6.